On a sweltering July night in 1881, a single gunshot echoed through a darkened bedroom in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and with it, one of the most enduring legends of the American West was born. The man who fell that night was barely 21 years old, yet his name would become synonymous with the Wild West itself. They called him Billy the Kid, and for over a century, his story has been told and retold, twisted and embellished, until the line between truth and myth became almost impossible to discern. He has been portrayed as everything from a cold-blooded villain to a misunderstood hero, a ruthless outlaw to a victim of circumstance. But who was the real Billy the Kid? What actually happened in those final moments? And how did a young drifter with a crooked smile become America's most famous gunslinger? To understand the legend, we must first strip away the mythology and confront the raw, often brutal reality of the man and the world that shaped him. The American Southwest in the 1872 was a land caught between two eras, a vast and unforgiving territory where the old ways were dying and the new order had not yet fully taken hold. The Civil War had ended just a decade earlier, leaving the nation fractured and thousands of young men adrift, many of them heading west in search of fresh starts or simply escape. New Mexico Territory was a place of extremes, a landscape of scorching deserts and snow-capped mountains, of sprawling cattle ranches and dusty frontier towns, where violence was commonplace, and law enforcement was often arbitrary and corrupt. This was not the romanticized West of Dime novels and later Hollywood films. It was a harsh, dangerous world, where survival often depended on one's willingness to use force, and where disputes over land, water, and livestock could escalate into deadly feuds that lasted for years. The territory was still reeling from the aftermath of the Indian Wars, and tensions between Anglo settlers, Hispanic residents, and native tribes created a volatile mix. Into this chaotic environment came thousands of opportunists, ranchers, merchants, and outlaws, all seeking to carve out their fortunes. The federal government's presence was minimal, and local power structures were often dominated by a handful of wealthy men who controlled the economy and the legal system. Corruption was endemic, and the line between legitimate business and outright criminality was frequently blurred. It was a world perfectly designed to produce legends and tragedies in equal measure, and it was into this world that a young boy with nothing to his name would soon arrive. The boy who would become Billy the Kid was born Henry McCarty, most likely in New York City, sometime around 1859, though the exact date and location of his birth remain subjects of historical debate. What we know for certain is that his early life was marked by poverty, instability, and loss. His father, if he was ever truly in the picture, remains a complete mystery. Not a single confirmed record of him exists. His mother, Catherine McCarty, was an Irish immigrant who struggled to provide for Henry and his older brother Joseph in the teeming slums of Manhattan. The family's circumstances were desperate, and at some point in the 1860s, Catherine made the difficult decision to move west, likely seeking better opportunities and perhaps hoping the drier climate might ease her worsening tuberculosis. The family eventually settled in Wichita, Kansas, where Catherine met and fell in love with a man named William Antrim, a Civil War veteran and itinerant laborer. In 1873, Catherine and William were married in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the family moved to the rough mining town of Silver City in the southwestern corner of the territory. For young Henry, now around 14 years old, this was supposed to be a new beginning. But just a year later, in September 1874, his mother succumbed to tuberculosis, and the light that had guided his childhood was extinguished. William Antrim, his stepfather, showed little interest in raising two adolescent boys who were not his own, and Henry found himself effectively orphaned, adrift in a frontier town with no family, no prospects, and no clear path forward. It was a devastating loss at a formative age, and it marked the beginning of his descent into the world of petty crime and violence. In the months following his mother's passing, Henry McCarty began to fall in with the wrong crowd in Silver City. He was a bright, charismatic boy, small in stature, and possessing a certain boyish charm that made him popular despite his circumstances. But charm could not put food on the table or provide shelter, and he soon turned to theft to survive. His first recorded brush with the law came in September 1875, when he was arrested for stealing a bundle of laundry, a petty crime born of desperation rather than malice. The local sheriff, perhaps seeing a troubled youth rather than a hardened criminal, placed him in jail but did not treat the offense too harshly. However, Henry, humiliated and fearful of the consequences, made a fateful decision. He escaped custody by shimmying up a chimney and fleeing Silver City altogether, leaving behind the last remnants of his childhood and any chance at a conventional life. He wandered across the territory, working odd jobs on ranches and in saloons, slowly learning the skills that would define his later years: how to handle horses, how to survive in the unforgiving desert, and most importantly, how to use a gun. Somewhere along the way, Henry McCarty adopted a new name, calling himself William H. Bonney, though friends and acquaintances began to refer to him simply as the Kid, because of his youthful appearance and slight build. It was during this period of drifting that he committed his first confirmed act of violence, an event that would set him irrevocably on the path to infamy. On the 17th of August, 1877, in a small settlement near Fort Grant in Arizona Territory, 18-year-old Billy got into a heated argument with a man named Frank Windy Cahill, a local bully and blacksmith who had been tormenting him for days. Accounts of the incident vary, but most witnesses agreed that Cahill, who was significantly larger and older, had been physically abusing Billy, calling him a pimp and repeatedly knocking him to the ground during a card game. The confrontation escalated, and in a moment of rage or fear, or perhaps both, Billy drew a revolver and shot Cahill in the stomach. Cahill lingered for a day before succumbing to his wound, and Billy, now a wanted man, fled back into New Mexico Territory, leaving behind his first victim and crossing a line from which there would be no return. The newspapers of the time reported the incident as a cowardly act, but those who knew Billy insisted it was self-defense against a violent aggressor. Regardless of the truth, the pattern was set. Billy the Kid was now a fugitive, and his life would be defined by violence, pursuit, and the ever-narrowing options of a young man on the run. Billy drifted eastward into the volatile heart of New Mexico Territory, eventually arriving in Lincoln County in late 1877, a place that would become the crucible of his legend. Lincoln County was a powder keg waiting to explode, dominated by a bitter and violent struggle for economic and political control known as the Lincoln County War. At the center of this conflict were two rival factions. On one side was the House, a powerful mercantile monopoly controlled by Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, Irish immigrants who had built a vast commercial empire through ruthless business practices, political manipulation, and outright intimidation. They controlled the county's only significant store, held lucrative government contracts to supply beef to the nearby Fort Stanton and the Mescalero Apache Reservation, and had most of the local law enforcement in their pocket. On the other side was a coalition of smaller ranchers and merchants, led by John Tunstall, a young, idealistic English gentleman rancher, and his business partner, Alexander McSween. A principled but politically naive lawyer, Tunstall and McSween sought to break the house's monopoly by opening a competing store and bank, offering fairer prices and challenging the corrupt system. It was a David versus Goliath struggle, and it was about to turn spectacularly bloody. Billy, still using the name William Bonney, found work as a ranch hand on Tunstall's sprawling spread, and he quickly formed a deep bond with his employer. Tunstall, unlike most men Billy had known, treated him with kindness and respect, seeing potential in the young drifter. For Billy, Tunstall became something of a father figure, the first man since his stepfather's abandonment to show him genuine care. This relationship would prove to be both a blessing and a curse, for when the violence finally erupted, Billy's loyalty to Tunstall would drag him into the heart of the maelstrom. The Lincoln County War officially began on the 18th of February, 1878, with an act of cold-blooded violence that shocked even the hardened residents of the territory. A posse, ostensibly acting under the authority of Sheriff William Brady, a close ally of the Dolan faction, rode out to Tunstall's ranch with a dubious warrant to seize his cattle and horses. Tunstall, accompanied by Billy and several other ranch hands, was driving a small herd when the posse confronted them. What happened next remains disputed, but the outcome was undeniable. John Tunstall was shot and killed, his body left sprawled in the dirt of a lonely canyon. Some accounts claim he tried to surrender, others that he resisted, but Billy, who witnessed the event from a distance, was certain of one thing. It was an execution, a deliberate act orchestrated by Dolan's faction to eliminate their rival. The loss of Tunstall was devastating to Billy. The one man who had shown him decency and a path toward a legitimate life was gone, murdered by men who hid behind the veneer of legal authority. In that moment, something fundamental shifted within Billy. His grief transformed into a burning desire for vengeance, and he swore an oath to those who would listen that he would not rest until every man responsible for Tunstall's demise had paid with his life. It was a vow that would define the rest of his short, violent existence and cement his transformation from a drifting ranch hand into one of the most feared gunmen in the Southwest. In the chaotic weeks following Tunstall's slaying, Lincoln County descended into open warfare. Alexander McSween, though not a violent man himself, became the de facto leader of the Tunstall faction, now known as the Regulators. This group, which included Billy and a collection of other young gunmen, styled themselves as a legitimate posse deputized by the local Justice of the Peace, John Wilson, with orders to arrest those responsible for Tunstall's end. In reality, they were vigilantes, dispensing their own brutal form of frontier justice. Over the next several months, the violence escalated dramatically. The Regulators hunted down and confronted members of the Dolan faction, and the confrontations often ended in bloodshed. On the 1st of April 1878, Billy and several Regulators ambushed Sheriff William Brady and his deputy George Hindman on the main street of Lincoln, gunning them down in broad daylight. It was a calculated act of revenge, as Brady had been directly involved in the posse that ended Tunstall's life. Billy, hiding behind an adobe wall, was reported to have fired the fatal shots, and he even ran out to retrieve a rifle from Brady's body before being driven back by gunfire. The action transformed Billy from a participant in the war into one of its most wanted figures, now a confirmed outlaw with a price on his head. The cycle of retribution continued unabated. Ranches were burned, cattle rustled, and men on both sides were ambushed and eliminated. The territorial government in Santa Fe, distant and ineffectual, seemed powerless to stop the carnage. Newspapers across the country began to report on the war in Lincoln County, painting it as a symbol of the lawlessness that still plagued the American frontier. The climax of the Lincoln County War came in mid-July 1878, during a 5-day siege known as the Battle of Lincoln. McSween, Billy, and approximately 60 Regulators barricaded themselves in McSween's large adobe home in the town of Lincoln, while a larger force of Dolan gunmen, bolstered by a detachment of U.S. Army cavalry from Fort Stanton, surrounded them. For days, the two sides exchanged gunfire. The streets of the small town transformed into a war zone. On the final day, July 19, the Dolan forces set fire to the McSween house, and as the flames spread, those inside were faced with a terrible choice: burn alive or make a desperate break for freedom. As darkness fell and the fire consumed the building, the Regulators made their move, bursting out of the burning structure in a chaotic, smoke-filled firefight. Alexander McSween, attempting to surrender, was shot down and killed along with several others. But Billy, displaying the quick thinking and nerve that would become his hallmark, managed to fight his way out, firing his revolver with deadly accuracy as he sprinted through the smoke and chaos, disappearing into the night. He had survived the inferno, but the Regulators were shattered, their cause effectively lost. With McSween gone and most of their allies dead, scattered, or in hiding, the Lincoln County War was over, and the Dolan faction had won. Yet Billy the Kid, now one of the most notorious figures in the territory, was still very much alive, still free, and still a threat. In the aftermath of the war, Billy found himself in an impossible position. He was an outlaw with a significant bounty on his head, wanted for multiple instances of violence, including the elimination of a sheriff. Yet he was also, in many ways, a victim of a corrupt system. A young man who had been drawn into a conflict not of his making, and had fought on the side that many local Hispanics and small ranchers believed was in the right. President Rutherford B. Hayes, alarmed by reports of the violence in New Mexico, appointed a new territorial governor, General Lew Wallace, a Civil War veteran and author who was tasked with restoring order. Wallace issued a general amnesty in November 1878, pardoning all participants in the Lincoln County War, but there was a critical exception. Those already under indictment for specific acts would not be covered. Billy, indicted for the shooting of Sheriff Brady, was not eligible. Desperate for a way out, Billy made a bold decision. In March 1879, he wrote directly to Governor Wallace, offering to testify against other participants in the war in exchange for a pardon. Wallace, intrigued, and perhaps seeing an opportunity to bring some closure to the affair, agreed to meet with Billy secretly. The two men had a cordial, even friendly conversation, and Wallace promised that if Billy testified, he would receive his pardon. Billy kept his end of the bargain, testifying in court and providing valuable information. But Wallace, distracted by his literary work on the novel Ben-Hur and facing political pressure, ultimately reneged on his promise. The pardon never came. Billy felt betrayed, and his brief hope for redemption turned to bitter disillusionment. With no legal protection and enemies on all sides, he returned to the only life he knew, that of a fugitive and an outlaw. Over the next 2 years, Billy the Kid's legend grew, even as his actual circumstances became increasingly desperate. He survived by rustling cattle, a common crime in the territory, often working with a loose network of other outlaws and disaffected ranchers. He was charming and generous with those he trusted, often sharing his stolen proceeds with impoverished Hispanic families in the area, which earned him a degree of loyalty and protection among the local population. To them, he was not a villain but Billito, a friendly, brave young man who spoke fluent Spanish and treated them with respect, a stark contrast to the Anglo establishment that often exploited them. But to the territorial authorities and the powerful cattlemen whose herds he was depleting, he was a menace that needed to be eliminated. The newspapers fed the public's appetite for stories about the daring young outlaw, often exaggerating his exploits, claiming he had ended 21 men by the age of 21, one for each year of his life, a claim that was almost certainly false. Most credible historians place the number of men Billy actually ended at somewhere between 4 and 9, and even then, many of those were in open combat or self-defense during the Lincoln County War. Nevertheless, the myth was more powerful than the truth, and Billy the Kid was becoming a household name across America, a symbol of the Wild West's defiance of civilization's encroachment. By late 1880, the situation had reached a breaking point. The powerful cattle ranchers of the territory, organized into associations, demanded action, and they found their champion in a new Lincoln County sheriff, Pat Garrett. Garrett was a tall, imposing former buffalo hunter and bartender who had actually been friendly with Billy in earlier years. They had gambled together, shared drinks, and by some accounts, had even been relatively close. But Garrett was ambitious, and he saw the capture of Billy the Kid as his path to fame and fortune. Elected sheriff in November 1880 on a platform of law and order, Garrett wasted no time. He organized a posse and began a relentless pursuit of Billy and his gang. In mid-December, Garrett tracked them to a ranch near Fort Sumner and ambushed them, engaging in a brief but intense gunfight. One of Billy's closest friends, Tom O'Folliard, was shot and mortally wounded, lingering in agony for nearly an hour before passing. Billy managed to escape once again, but the net was tightening. Just days later, on the 23rd of December 1880, Garrett and his men cornered Billy and the remnants of his gang at a stone house called Stinking Springs. After a tense standoff and another exchange of gunfire that resulted in the ending of another gang member, Charlie Bowdra, Billy finally surrendered, realizing that further resistance was futile. He was taken into custody, shackled, and transported to the town of Mesilla to stand trial for the slaying of Sheriff Brady. The trial of Billy the Kid was a foregone conclusion. He was convicted of the deliberate ending of William Brady and sentenced to hang on the 13th of May, 1881. The judge, in a coldly formal pronouncement, told Billy that he would be hanged by the neck until he was dead, dead, dead. Billy, ever defiant, is reported to have replied with dark humor, "And you can go to hell, hell, hell." He was transferred back to Lincoln and held on the second floor of the old Murphy Dolan store, now serving as the county courthouse, under the guard of 2 deputies, James Bell and Bob Olinger. Olinger was a brutal, sadistic man who took perverse pleasure in taunting his prisoner, constantly reminding Billy of his impending execution. Bell, by contrast, was more sympathetic, and Billy bided his time, waiting for an opportunity. On the evening of the 28th of April 1881, just 2 weeks before his scheduled hanging, that opportunity arrived. The exact details of Billy's escape remain the subject of debate, but the most widely accepted account is as follows. While Olinger was across the street having dinner, Billy asked Bell to escort him to the outdoor privy. On the way back up the stairs, Billy, who was shackled but whose hands were not bound, managed to slip one hand free from his cuffs. At the top of the stairs, he either grabbed Bell's own revolver or retrieved a weapon that had been hidden for him by a Confederate. The historical record is unclear. A brief struggle ensued, and Billy shot Bell, who staggered down the stairs and out into the street, collapsing and succumbing to his wound. Hearing the gunshot, Olinger ran back toward the courthouse. Billy, now armed with a shotgun he found in the office, appeared at a second-story window and called out to Olinger. As the deputy looked up, Billy fired both barrels, blowing Olinger off his feet and ending him instantly. Billy then calmly broke the shotgun over Ollinger's head, a final act of contempt for the man who had tormented him. He forced a bystander to break his leg irons with a pickaxe, commandeered a horse, and rode out of Lincoln, vanishing once again into the vast New Mexico landscape. It was a daring, audacious escape that only added to his legend, but it also sealed his fate. He was now the most wanted man in the territory, and Pat Garrett, humiliated by the escape, was more determined than ever to hunt him down. For the next 2.5 months, Billy remained at large, hiding out with friends and sympathizers in the Fort Sumner area, a predominantly Hispanic community where he had many allies. Garrett, working on tips and rumors, slowly closed in. On the night of the 14th of July 1881, acting on information that Billy might be in the area, Garrett and 2 deputies, John Poe and Thomas McKinney, rode quietly into Fort Sumner under cover of darkness. They went to the home of Pete Maxwell, a wealthy local rancher who was known to be friendly with Billy. Garrett entered Maxwell's darkened bedroom alone, sitting down on the edge of the bed to question him about Billy's whereabouts. At that very moment, by sheer chance, or perhaps fate, Billy the Kid was nearby, staying in an old barracks building on Maxwell's property. Hungry and unaware of the danger, he decided to walk to Maxwell's house to cut a piece of meat from a beef carcass that was hanging on the porch. He was in his stocking feet, wearing only a vest and trousers, and he was armed with a knife and a revolver. As he approached the porch, he noticed 2 unfamiliar figures, Garrett's deputies, standing in the shadows. Startled, Billy drew his pistol and backed toward Maxwell's bedroom door, whispering in Spanish, "Queeness! Queeness! Who is it?" He stepped into the darkened room, and in the dim light, he could make out the silhouette of a man sitting on the bed, but he did not recognize him as Garrett. He approached Maxwell and whispered urgently, asking who the strangers were outside. Pete Maxwell, terrified, said nothing. Garrett, recognizing Billy's voice, drew his own revolver. Billy, sensing danger but still unsure who was in the room, took another step forward, repeating his question. In that instant, Pat Garrett fired twice. The first bullet struck Billy in the chest, just above his heart, piercing his lung. The second shot went wild, hitting the wall. Billy the Kid staggered backward, gasped, and collapsed onto the floor. He was gone within moments, ending the life of America's most famous outlaw at the age of 21. The immediate aftermath of Billy's demise was chaotic and confusing. Garrett and his deputies, unsure if they had actually hit their target in the darkness, hesitated before lighting a candle. When they finally did, they found Billy's body sprawled on the floor, a small pool of blood spreading beneath him. The news spread quickly through Fort Sumner, and by morning, a crowd had gathered. Many of the local residents, particularly the Hispanic families who had sheltered and befriended Billy, were genuinely grief-stricken, weeping openly as his body was prepared for burial. He was laid to rest in the old military cemetery at Fort Sumner, next to his friends Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Bowdra. A simple wooden marker bearing the inscription, "Pals, Pat Garrett," meanwhile, became an instant hero in the eyes of the territorial establishment. celebrated in newspapers across the country as the man who had finally brought the notorious Billy the Kid to justice. He would later write a ghostwritten biography, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, which became a bestseller and further cemented the legend, though it was filled with exaggerations and self-serving distortions. For Garrett, however, the fame proved fleeting and ultimately tragic. He struggled with financial problems, failed in several business ventures, and his reputation was tarnished by accusations of corruption. In 1908, at the age of 57, Pat Garrett was himself shot and ended under mysterious circumstances on a lonely road near Las Cruces, New Mexico, a killing that remains officially unsolved to this day. Almost immediately after Billy's demise, the legend began to overshadow the reality, and over the subsequent decades, the line between fact and fiction became hopelessly blurred. Dime novels, which were the pulp fiction of the era, churned out sensationalized stories about Billy the Kid, portraying him variously as a bloodthirsty demon or a noble Robin Hood figure who stole from the rich to give to the poor. The truth, as is so often the case, was far more complex and less melodramatic. Billy was neither a saint nor a monster. He was a product of his brutal environment, a young man who had been dealt a terrible hand by fate and had responded with a mixture of charm, defiance, and violence. He was capable of genuine loyalty and kindness, particularly to those he considered friends or to the marginalized Hispanic communities that sheltered him. But he was also a thief and a participant in acts of violence, a man who lived by the gun and ultimately perished by it. The myth of Billy the Kid says more about America's enduring fascination with the Wild West than it does about the actual person. We want our outlaws to be larger than life, to embody either pure villainy or misunderstood heroism, because it makes for a better story. The real Billy, a complicated, flawed, and ultimately tragic figure, is, in many ways, more interesting than any of the legends, but he is also harder to pin down, harder to categorize, and thus less satisfying to those who crave simple narratives of good versus evil. One of the most persistent and intriguing controversies surrounding Billy the Kid is the question of whether he actually perished that night in Pete Maxwell's bedroom, or whether he somehow survived and lived out his days under an assumed identity. This theory, which has captivated amateur historians and conspiracy theorists for over a century, is fueled by several factors. First, the room was pitch dark, and Garrett fired at a figure he identified primarily by voice, not by sight. Second, the body was buried quickly, within 24 hours, and in the confusion, some have questioned whether proper identification was made. Over the years, several men came forward claiming to be the real Billy the Kid, the most famous of whom was Brushy Bill Roberts, an elderly man from Texas who in 1950 petitioned the governor of New Mexico for a pardon, insisting he was Billy and that another man had perished in his place. Roberts's story was detailed, and he knew a great deal about Billy's life, but historians and forensic experts who have examined the evidence overwhelmingly conclude that his claim was false. DNA testing has been proposed multiple times to settle the matter definitively by comparing genetic material from Billy's supposed gravesite with that of his mother, Catherine, but legal and logistical challenges have repeatedly stalled these efforts. The consensus among serious scholars is clear. Billy the Kid did indeed perish on the 14th of July 1881 in Fort Sumner, shot by Pat Garrett. The survival theories, while entertaining, are almost certainly the products of wishful thinking and the enduring human desire to believe that legends never truly fade away. So what, in the end, is the true legacy of Billy the Kid? His life, brief and violent as it was, has had an outsized impact on American culture and mythology. He represents the romanticized image of the Wild West, a time and place that existed for only a few short decades, but that has been endlessly mythologized in literature, film, and popular imagination. Billy's story has been told and retold in countless books, movies, and television shows, each generation reimagining him to fit its own values and preoccupations. In the early 20th century, he was often portrayed as a villain, a symbol of lawlessness that civilization had rightly vanquished. During the countercultural movements of the 1000, 960 seconds and 70 seconds, he was recast as an anti-establishment hero, a rebel fighting against corrupt authority, More recent portrayals have attempted to present a more nuanced view, acknowledging both his violence and his victimization, his charm and his ruthlessness. What makes Billy the Kid's story so enduringly powerful is not the specifics of what he did, but what he represents. The idea of the individual standing against overwhelming odds, the young man who refused to be broken by a harsh world, and the eternal American tension between freedom and law, between the wild frontier and encroaching civilization. He was a real person, not a character in a storybook, and the choices he made, good and bad, were his own. But the legend that grew up around him, that legend, belongs to all of us, a mirror in which we see our own conflicted feelings about authority, justice, and the price of freedom. The reality of Billy the Kid's life stands in stark contrast to the mythology that has consumed it. He was not the prolific gunslinger of legend who ended 21 men. He was not a cold-blooded outlaw who sought violence for its own sake, nor was he the Robin Hood figure, a noble bandit righting wrongs and defending the downtrodden. He was, instead, a young man born into poverty and hardship, orphaned at a vulnerable age, and thrust into a violent world where survival often required moral compromises. He was intelligent, literate, charismatic, and by all accounts, possessed a quick wit and an infectious charm that won him friends even among those who might have been his enemies. He was also capable of shocking violence when cornered or when defending those he considered his own. His participation in the Lincoln County War was not a quest for glory but an act of loyalty to a man who had shown him kindness, and his subsequent descent into outlawry was as much a product of betrayal by those in power as it was of his own choices. The system failed him, repeatedly. A promised pardon was withheld, legal protections were denied, and he was hounded not because he was uniquely evil, but because he was convenient, a scapegoat for a political establishment desperate to impose order on a chaotic frontier. In his final years, he was a man with no way out, trapped between his past and a future that offered only a hangman's noose or a bullet. He chose to keep running, to keep fighting, until the inevitable end came in that darkened room. In the decades since his passing, Fort Sumner has become a pilgrimage site for those fascinated by the legend of Billy the Kid. His grave, marked now by a more substantial monument, surrounded by a protective cage to prevent souvenir hunters from chipping away at the stone, is visited by thousands each year. The town has embraced its connection to the outlaw, with museums, historical markers, and annual festivals celebrating his memory. Nearby Lincoln, the site of the climactic battle of the Lincoln County War and his daring escape, has been preserved as a living museum, its streets and buildings looking much as they did in 1881. These places serve as physical reminders of a vanished world, a time when the American frontier was still a place of danger, opportunity, and moral ambiguity. But they also raise important questions about how we remember and commemorate our history. Should we celebrate a man who, whatever his redeeming qualities, was undeniably involved in acts of violence? Or should we view him as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when social systems fail the vulnerable, and when justice becomes a tool of the powerful? The answer, perhaps, is that we should do both. Billy the Kid was a product of his time, shaped by forces largely beyond his control, and his story illuminates the darker corners of the American experience, the violence, the injustice, and the desperation that were as much a part of the frontier as the opportunity and freedom. The transformation of Billy the Kid from a real person into a cultural icon began almost immediately after his demise, and has continued unabated for nearly a century and a half. The process reveals much about how mythology is created, and why certain figures capture the public imagination while others fade into obscurity. Billy had several qualities that made him perfect material for legend making. He was young, which allowed for narratives of tragic potential cut short. He was handsome by the standards of his time, with the famous tintype photograph showing a slight, boyish figure with a crooked, almost playful smile. He operated in a visually dramatic landscape, the sun-scorched deserts and rugged mountains of the Southwest, which provided a perfect backdrop for tales of adventure. And perhaps most importantly, he existed at a pivotal moment in American history, during the closing of the frontier, when the nation was anxiously grappling with what it meant to be American. Whether the country's identity was rooted in rugged individualism and freedom, or in law, order, and progress, Billy represented the former, a symbol of a wilder, freer time that was rapidly disappearing, and Americans, even as they celebrated the advance of civilization, felt a deep nostalgia for what was being lost. This nostalgia has only grown over time, and with each retelling, Billy's story has been adapted to reflect contemporary concerns and values, ensuring that his legend remains relevant to new generations. Today, more than 140 years after that fatal shot in Pete Maxwell's bedroom, Billy the Kid remains one of the most recognizable figures of the American West, his name instantly familiar even to those who know little else about frontier history. His story has been dramatized in over 50 films, from early silent pictures to modern Hollywood productions, each offering its own interpretation. He has been the subject of countless songs, from traditional folk ballads to rock anthems, his name invoked as a symbol of rebellion and doomed youth. Historians continue to debate the details of his life, searching for new documents, conducting interviews with descendants of those who knew him, and arguing over interpretations of his actions. Meanwhile, amateur sleuths and conspiracy theorists continue to pursue alternative theories about his fate. Their efforts are testament to the enduring power of his legend and the human reluctance to let go of a compelling mystery. But perhaps what is most remarkable about Billy the Kid is not the legend itself, but what it reveals about us. Our continued fascination with this young outlaw speaks to something deep within the American psyche, a tension between our reverence for law and order and our admiration for those who defy it, between our desire for safety and our romantic attachment to danger and freedom. Billy the Kid, in all his complexity, his violence and his charm, his loyalty and his lawlessness, embodies this contradiction, and that is why his story, in one form or another, will likely endure as long as America itself continues to grapple with the meaning of its frontier past and the cost of its civilized present.